All right, Tansi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, Erica Violet Lee Netsika-san, Misasko Toma Niknitotsen. My name is Erica Violet Lee, and I'm here from Saskatoon, Treaty 6 territory and Métis homeland. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's an honor to be part of this webinar. I want to thank the Indigenous Climate Action Network for putting this together and getting us together to have this discussion. I think it's really crucial and timely, as it always is, but especially now. And I want to start by acknowledging what is probably on a lot of people's minds, that we're talking about climate in the context today of extraordinary police brutality and violence against Black and Brown people across the world. I want to name Yaneth Yorkia, a land defender who was murdered last night, Philando Castile, who was killed by police in the United States, and Alton Sterling, who was murdered just the other day. I think that when we're having discussions of climate justice, we have to recognize that these issues are deeply intertwined with violence on Black and Brown people and Indigenous people all over the world. So without addressing police brutality and colonialism, we won't get anywhere in our climate movements. So I just wanted to open in that way. I think we're going to start with Ariel Deranger, who is the communications manager of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation of Alberta in Canada, one of the most powerful and tireless activists working to resist the devastation caused by the fossil fuel industry's immense extractive operations in Alberta's tar sands, both locally in her people's ancestral homelands in the boreal forest around Lake Athabasca, downstream from the oil sands, and to the world community and global biosphere already in the throes of climate change-induced cataclysm. Ariel has organized demonstrations and campaigns, initiated lawsuits, and traveled the world speaking to audiences, including at the UN, to defend her people's right to survive and the fragile ecosystems and wildlife habitat of northern forests at risk of annihilation, as well as the very future of life on this planet. So we'll start with Ariel if she's free. I don't think she is actually. Okay, where'd you go, Ariel? There. Okay,
I was
perfect.
just getting my stuff ready and I didn't need everyone to see me. So thank you so much, Erica. Erica herself has been a great voice and advocate within the climate movement, sort of bringing to light some really fantastic things. So I just want to thank Erica for being here, so Masicho, and Masicho for all the speakers for being here today and all of the participants, and we welcome your feedback towards the end. Now, I just wanted to start to give a high-profile overview of why this conversation is so relevant and important right now. And sorry, I just need to. So basically, what we're looking at right now is Canada is building something that they're calling Canada's approach to climate change. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Oh, great. So Canada has built this website and this portal where they're trying to get people to submit their ideas on how to address climate change. And during a meeting in January of this, the governments, premiers all got together and they met with Trudeau to have this meeting called in Vancouver, where they created something called the Vancouver Declaration, where they were coming up with strategies to address climate change. And they created these 4 tables: how and where to reduce emissions, which deals with mitigation and mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gas in the country. And the second table was ideas for clean technology, innovation, and jobs, which deals with things like solar, wind, hydro, different types of technologies that can be utilized to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions in the country. The third was preparing for the impacts of climate change, which deals with adaptation and mitigation issues and ways that we can adapt to the changing climate and how we can mitigate those impacts that we are currently dealing with. The third table was putting a price on carbon, so talking about carbon pricing and how it can be used as a way to shift our economies into a new sort of clean technology type of way. What's been really interesting in how it relates to Indigenous people's rights, that one of the other things that came out of this meeting was that they wanted to work with Indigenous peoples. That was a key element of their work in addressing those 4 groups. What we've seen to date is that there hasn't really been a lot of actual engagement with Indigenous peoples or inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights within the context of those 4 tables. In addition to not really engaging with Indigenous communities and folks, the sort of the dates that they've put together for the public engagement process, which started in April, and is set to end actually at the end of July. They're supposed to be closing this online portal. They want to have all their submissions for all of this work to be done by the end of July so that the ministers can meet to discuss how all of the feedback from those 4 sort of working groups and tables they can come up with a Canada's approach to climate change. So that's kind of what's been going on at this point as far as Canada's sort of approach to climate change. It's really, really a bit frustrating for us as organizers, because we're finding that we're not really getting a lot of input. We're not really being included into the larger discourse. And so what Indigenous Climate Action has done is we've created an online survey of our own, independent of the federal government sort of online input, which you can go to that one right here, where they're looking for your ideas. So you can submit your ideas in any of these 4 key areas that the government has created. But Indigenous Climate Action wants to know if you even feel that our rights are actually included within that. And we encourage you all to take a survey, which you can find on our website. It's at the bottom of our website at indigenousclimateaction.com, to let us know how you feel about the current process that the government is doing and engaging on. And I just sort of wanted to end with one more thing, which is that, you know, we have provinces that are also looking to develop their own climate leadership plans independent of the federal plan. Alberta has been one of those governments that has moved forward to do that, and very similarly to the federal government's efforts, they haven't done much as far as outreach to First Nations communities, and including our issues within their sort of climate plan, which looks at ending coal, carbon pricing, capping emissions, and reducing methane emissions. Those are the high-end pieces. But within each one of those sectors, there hasn't been a lot of outreach and work into how those approaches to addressing climate change would benefit or not benefit Indigenous communities. These things and these policies have huge implications on our rights. We're talking about creating policies from everything to reducing the emissions through different types of technologies, creating new job sectors and employment sectors for our communities, changing building code standards, transportation and fuel consumption standards in the country. And if we aren't a part of those conversations, we're going to have a lot of issues in our community to overcome the obstacles of meeting those new commitments that our governments are making. So it's absolutely imperative that our communities become more aware of these issues and get involved in these discussions, whether it's in our own communities to develop our own frameworks, or at the regional levels with the provinces and demanding recognition of our rights there, or at the federal level. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that provinces are making their own plans as well as the federal government, and there are ways to get involved. And I also encourage you all to take a look at our survey on the Indigenous Climate Action website. So that is all I have to say at this point. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope to get some questions towards the end, and I'm going to turn off my camera now and hand it back over to Erica.
Thank you, Ariel. So we're going to next go to Chief Bill Erasmus, if he is here. Are you on this call?
He just messaged me and he can't. He
Okay.
got the wrong number. I've got to message him. So if we can go to Art, if you're okay with that, Art.
So, yeah, we're going to go to Arthur Manuel next, who is an extraordinary First Nations political leader in Canada, growing up on the Niskonawlis Reserve in the interior of British Columbia. He's the father of 5 children. Art has held positions as both a chair and the elected chief of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council. He also co-chaired the Assembly of First Nations Delgamuukw Implementation Strategic Committee that was mandated to develop a national strategy to compel the federal government to respect the historic Supreme Court decision on Aboriginal title and rights. Art has been active at the international and United Nations level as part of the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus, with a heavy focus on economies and trade in relation to violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. He's a published author and wrote an extraordinary book that I know many frontline activists and academics alike are using in their everyday work. Since 2003, he's served as a spokesperson for the Indigenous Network on Economies and Trade, a network of Indigenous nations working on the international level to achieve recognition. Working through INET, Manuel succeeded in having the struggle for Aboriginal title and treaty rights injected into international financial institutions. He's currently a member of the board of directors for the 7th Generation Fund for Indian Development and a spokesperson for Defenders of the Land, an activist network aligned with the Idle No More movement. So go ahead, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. Anyways, I guess what I want to do is start talking from the point of view of the land. My late father, George Manuel, used to say it all has to do with the land. You know, and there's no question in my mind that all of North America is indigenous land. There's no question about it. But I know when you get outside the Indian Reserve, you run into problems because you run into the Fisheries Act, you run into the Forestry Act, you run into the Mining Act, Highway Act, the Park Act. You run into all kinds of different federal and provincial legislation. And all over North America, it's either federal Canadian or federal United States or state United States or provincial provinces laws that are out there, and we run into them. And there's no question we need to assert our sovereignty. My daughters spent time in jail because they were off the Nisqually Indian Reserve asserting sovereignty in the Sun Peaks ski resort area. And the government resorts to injunctions, enforcement orders, calls in the RCMP. And if the RCMP can't handle it, then they call in the army. You know, it all has to do with the land. And I always show this picture here. I don't know, but I always show the reserves. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it, or I can see it in my screen? But anyways.
Christine, can you share his screen?
Yeah, I'll share right now.
Okay. Because what I always show is when you add up all the Indian reserves in Canada. I'll show my screen. Oh, that's it. When you add up all the Indian reserves in Canada, we have 0.2% of the land. And like when we're talking about challenging the tar sands or challenging Kinder Morgan, we're always running into federal and provincial government, either NEB or some provincial environmental assessment legislation. And that's the way we seem to are dovetailed into moving into that kind of framework. And those kinds of frameworks are designed to basically, in the end, validate the pipeline or validate the mine or validate the forestry cutting plan or whatever have you, or the federal government's fishing strategy or whatever have you. It's all designed basically to dovetail into that legislation. Because the white man, when he first came here, he was totally shocked and stunned by the size of the trees that are out here in our North America. They were shocked at the amount of cod that was in the Atlantic Ocean. They were shocked at the abundance of resources that our communities have, over the centuries, built up. And they actually looked at us as childish because we never exploited those resources. And they came in and they took the cream of the crop. You know, in British Columbia, used to be in my reserve and where we live now, Nisqually, you can still find stumps that are 4 feet across.
Hmm.
You know, and this is in the interior. This is in the dry belt area, the interior of BC, not the coast. And that's the size trees they used to have. Nowadays, when you look at a logging truck on the Trans-Canada Highway going to the logs are the size of fence posts. You know, at the time of my when I was a child, if you ever seen a truck like that, everybody would laugh at it because it's not even big trees. But they've literally killed all those trees since then. And, you know, and they fished all the cod. You know, for the kind of economic system, they will fish for the last cod and they'll fish for the last salmon and they'll log to the last tree just to make money, you know? And that's how they treat land. One of the things that I always say, you know, like when we talk to environmentalists especially, is that in the white man's world, environment is a department within the framework of the federal cabinet. It's a department within the framework of the provincial government's cabinet. But all the other ministries within that government are all got to do with exploiting the land and exploiting the water and exploiting the air. All of them to liquefy those resources into cash. You know, I've actually I got another screen here. I don't know if you can see it about the different earth values, and there's 2 different earth sets of values as I see as an Indigenous person. You know, there's the earth values that we always hear about all our relatives, and you know that the land, the animals, air, and water, everything is equal to us as people, and that we make decisions accordingly, which means the whole system is an environmental system. There's no such thing as an environmental department. The whole system is an environmental system. Whereas in a Eurocentric concept of Earth, they look at the land as a resource, and it's from that resource that you have production, you produce garbage, and you produce profit. And they're always looking at that profit because they look at money, the liquefaction of the either gold or liquefaction of the salmon, the liquefaction of the trees into profit. It turns into money, and it's the money that's the most important thing, not the balance between water and land and people. That's not a valuable thing. So when we're talking about how do you deal with this whole concept of interactions between you know, the Western pure hierarchy of economics and the traditional based sense of economics, that's the battle that's going on, and it's the same battle that was there when Christopher Columbus landed in North America. It's the same battle, and it's still going on today. It's just that the environment that we're operating in terms of the planet has changed substantively, and that's what climate change is all about. It's when the looking at the land as a resource has lost it. It's getting down to we've lost the cod. I was listening to a meeting with some elders the other day, and they said we're going to lose the salmon too. You know? And my dad said that before he passed away. He said we're going to lose the salmon, and that's a real indicator species in terms of like what's happening in terms of the thinking of people like Trudeau, the young Trudeau, and the thinking of Christy Clark in terms of climate change. Have they actually matured? Have they actually grown up enough to understand that this balance of system here is what is a fundamental core, and that Indigenous people really are the only ones that are mature enough and connected enough to the land to be able to stand up to people like tar sands, to stand up to organizations like Kinder Morgan, to stand up to all these big, huge mega projects, as they call them, and actually question the very legitimacy of those projects, not based upon whether money is more important than saving the earth. No, we know that saving the earth is more important. Like people that work with me, like Janice, Billy, my daughter Canahus, and all these different people, their primary purpose is to save the land, to protect the land for future generations. And that's the message, I think, that when we talk about climate change, that we need to get that through to the big NGOs and to big government. And but the land is the primary point that I'd like to say. Like, we need to move from that 0.2% Indian reserves to self-sufficient land basis, so that we can preserve our language and culture and build a self-sufficient economy. I think we need to root out the colonial doctrines of discovery and replace them with human rights, that we as Indigenous people have the right to self-determination, and that underlying title in North America is not crown title, but is actually the Indigenous Aboriginal title. So those are the main points I want to make. Okay, thank you. I think that's 15 minutes.
Thank you, Art. Do we have Bill yet? Anybody? Okay. I guess if Bill isn't here, we're going to go on to Ellen Gabriel.
Bill said that he was online. Just 1 second.
Sure.
Bill, are you there?
So in the meantime, I just want to let everyone know that you can, if you have any questions for our extraordinary panel, I know I have a bunch of questions, but if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat or tweet them using hashtag Indigenous Climate. You can contact Indigenous Climate Action Network on Twitter at Indigenous_CA, or you can ask them in the Facebook event page or on the Indigenous Climate Facebook. So if you have any questions for our speakers, put them in there and we'll get around to them at the end. So do we have Bill yet?
Bill, are you there? It says he's on.
Okay. Well, while we figure that out, we'll go on to Ellen Gabriel next, who is one of my heroes. Everybody here is are my heroes. But I remember growing up and especially seeing Ellen as a strong Indigenous woman in the media, taking no crap from governments, basically. So that's my introduction. But her formal introduction is growing up in Katsieswakas. Oh, I probably butchered that. Ellen Gabriel of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation Turtle Clan was always taught to be proud of her Kanien'kehá:ka heritage. Her role models, her grandmother, mother, and aunties were part of a group of Mohawk women who have fought for the rights of Native women since the creation of sexist policies of the Indian Act. Ellen has always had a passion for art and graduated from Concordia University in 1990 with a BFA. She worked as an illustrator and curriculum developer for the Kanesatake Resource Support to Native communities in need. She's taken a personal approach, seeing firsthand the impacts of fish farms in the Broughton Archipelago, lobbying on Parliament Hill to defeat the First Nations Governance Act, standing with elders of Treaty 8 against oil and gas development in the Peace River, burning referendum ballots with fellow chiefs in protest, and has stood on the steps of the legislature with 3,000 other people united under the Title and Rights Alliance banner. And so I'm going to give it away to Ellen right now for your remarks.
Naoko Erica, nagwas na yujats tanu aganyaktu kanasadage na hakanagere tinuaratus na nagagditawanere. Thank you, Erica, for the kind introduction, and to all of you who are listening, who are fighting the struggle. And I just want to acknowledge what Erica opened up with in regards to the police brutality, which the Permanent Forum mentioned this year. States should combat and should address the issues of police brutality, in particular against Indigenous women. I also want to echo and appreciate Naoko. Thank you, Arthur, for your discussion on the land, because I wholeheartedly agree that this is what this is all about, is the land. We talk about a human rights-based approach, using the declaration, but at the heart of it is, if we do not have a healthy environment, if our land is not healthy, then we are not healthy. The food that we're eating from the land is not healthy. The medicines that we are using for our health, whether it's our spiritual, physical, or mental health, if it's contaminated, then there's a problem in helping us. Because a human rights-based approach, using the declaration or using our own customary laws, it's really about that health. It's really about that peace, that respect, that strength, that vision that our ancestors told us we need to have for the future. In 2008, the Permanent Forum had said in their 7th session that climate change is an urgent and immediate threat to human rights, health, sustainable development, food sovereignty, peace, and security. And one of the things that I find is really interesting, and is kind of like, there's such a paradox at the United Nations, where you have language that is strong in the promotion of human rights, but how states interpret them is totally goes against what they have agreed upon. And so when I heard that, Minister Jody Raybould-Wilson, Minister Carolyn Bennett announced at the Permanent Forum this year their intention to fully implement the declaration. However, under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, it was a mixed bag, because how are we dealing with it today? If we look at it a couple of months later, the status quo remains. One of the things that I think is really disturbing about the policies that are being created is that it's relying on one national Aboriginal organization, essentially, to do its engagement sessions. These are not consultations. This is like, as in the Vancouver Declaration has said, they want to have broad engagement sessions with the Indigenous peoples. The Supreme Court has said that engagement sessions do not constitute consultations. We're talking about the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people. We're talking about, and this has to do with the health, this has to do with our right to self-determination, this has to do with everything that is the pillar of Indigenous identity, which is the land, the language, culture, and development. And one of the things that is really important is to consider in the context of this is that if we're taking a human rights-based approach, Indigenous people should insist on the rights-based approach of the environment and all our relations as well. It's not just about us, as Art has mentioned. And those social determinants of health, whether it's safe drinking water, adequate housing, safe supply of food, security. These are all the things that are human rights-based approach, but because of colonization, Indigenous peoples have always been the most marginalized and always had all of these kinds of things threatened against us. And the government is playing a lot of semantics in how they're doing the engagement sessions, which they'll later probably call consultations. But we as Indigenous people should be the ones to guide on how the implementation of the UN Declaration is put. We have many articles that reference free, prior, and informed consent, but at the same time, states also have an obligation, a positive obligation to promote and respect Indigenous people's human rights. They're not just rights, but they are human rights as well. And in that positive place, those corporations that are under their laws are to do no harm. That's part of their obligation, is to do no harm in respect to the rights of human beings, the environment, taking positive action. And one of the things that we notice is that in these so-called engagement sessions, how many Indigenous peoples are actually understand what's being done, and that's part of the whole process of self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. is, do Indigenous people really understand what's going on? We're talking about carbon taxes, we're talking about all kinds of things in where the majority of our communities are experiencing colonial poverty. So we have legislation that inhibits our economic growth. We either have to assimilate or remain in that colonial poverty to exist, to survive. And so those kinds of things that remains the status quo of colonialism are the things that Indigenous peoples are fighting. In order to decolonize, we also need to understand what our rights and obligations are. It's not just that we have rights, but that we have obligations. Just like states have obligations, we too have obligations to, if we're talking about sustainable development, to be careful as consumers. How are we as an individual consuming the kinds of things that we see in advertisement that tell us that we need to have? How is traditional knowledge going to be incorporated into any kind of climate change policy, whether it's provincial, whether it's national, whether it's international? And so there needs to be a mechanism in place that allows Indigenous people to have a voice, that allows every single Indigenous person as a rights holder to be able to participate and to be able to understand what exactly it is that we are trying to do in regards to climate change. Because one of the things that climate change is doing, it's changing the landscape. It's probably going to change our diet. It's going to change how we plant our crops. It's going to change, perhaps, some of our medicines will not be existing in 50 years. But all these things are part of our obligations, and as peoples with that right to self-determination, we need to protect those rights. And as Erica has mentioned before, there is the issue of police brutality, and as Art has mentioned, the attitude, the racist attitude that we saw and historically still exists today. So being the most marginalized group in this country means that we need to start working together. We need to agree to disagree. We need to be able to have that kind of process within ourselves that government does not have a right to say and control. That government does not have a right to say, well, we are only going to recognize this group. We're only going to allow this voice to be heard. We saw that Harper was doing it. We shouldn't allow this government that says they're going to talk about full implementation of the Declaration without the full and effective participation of us, without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people, and without everybody having a voice. The right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our own cultural heritage, our traditional knowledge, our cultural expressions. Those are some of the things that are the richness of Indigenous people. But if we're looking at climate change and how it's impacting the most marginalized of any group of people, which is women and children. Women and children, and now we're seeing that the Convention on the Rights to the Child, the Committee on the Rights to the Child, is looking at climate change and how it's impacting children, but in particular Indigenous children, where colonial poverty is a reality of their life, where colonial poverty is affecting whether or not they're going to help to develop in a healthy way. And we're looking at these kinds of jobs that are being thrown at our people's and communities' feet, which is probably, more the manual labor jobs that are not as well paid, which are not sustainable, which is ruining our aquifers, which is poisoning our air. All these great things that we see in the United Nations, whether it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or the Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, all these things need to be brought together and to decompartmentalize how we are viewing the human rights-based approach. If one right is violated, it's going to impact all the other rights. And this is the whole thing about Western ideology or Western philosophy, is that they compartmentalize things. And that's been part of the whole struggle. That's been part of the whole problem of why Indigenous people are not moving forward. So we're talking about the rights and the violence against Indigenous women. Meanwhile, all these other things are happening. Again, all these things should be happening in concert with each other. All these things are related. If the mother of the children who are being raised is not enjoying the fulfillment and her human rights, then the child is not going to enjoy their human rights. So climate change needs to include Indigenous people's voices. It needs to definitely not just be a token process by government. I looked at some of the timeline and where, you know, they're relying on the AFN AGA that's coming up as the process of where Indigenous people are going to be consulted or engaged in. Well, how many people are going to be able to go to that area? How many people are going to be able to be aware of what's even going on? So human rights standards, obligation, and principles are not being respected in this process. And so we need to start having that awareness of how this process is not for us, how this process is really the continuation of the status quo. And I look at Indigenous climate action, and I took the survey, and I think it was a great questionnaire. I think it's wonderful that people are starting to get aware through this organization, and I thank them for organizing this webinar. And I'm just kind of looking at the time here. But we see business as usual. I guess that's essentially what I wanted to say. And if we are, if our identity is land-based, if our language is land-based, our ceremonies, it's all about that land, why should we accept those kinds of destructive industries that don't take responsibility? You know, funding a cultural event in the city does not constitute corporate responsibility. Corporate responsibility means you do not repeat the mistakes that you're making. The tar sands is such a failure in regards to any kind of development, but yet that's what the government is continually using. And so a human rights-based approach would consider those kinds of things and insists that businesses and corporations act responsibly and take a look, as they are also responsible as their governments have been, to respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and all those other kinds of things, but also to respect our customary laws. If we look at the Iroquois people, it's the women who have title to the land. It's not to say that the men don't have a voice, but it's to say that we have customs that we need to have respected. We need to have a process where everybody's voice is respected. And so redress is an extremely important part. And the climate policy is extremely important. I won't disagree on that. That's something that everybody needs to take part in. But the process, it's the mechanism that is being used by the federal government that I think is really flawed, because the status quo remains. We are supposed to be the ones who develop our priorities. We are the ones that are supposed to be protecting and allow that right to protect our people without criminalization of our people, when they go to protest. It's the principles of equality, non-discrimination, the universality of human rights, and how the Declaration acknowledges the colonial and historical discrimination and racism that Indigenous people have had. This is really an important piece for people to really understand on how we're going to get the rights to health respected. You know, those basic human rights needs of water, clean air, adequate sanitation, all those things that give us life, those are in the earth. And if development is attacking that, if development is not addressing or is not respecting that, then people need to do something more than just create a policy that's going to be nice on paper, but it is not implemented in reality. And let me see if maybe I should just finish there. But I think the bottom line is that giving voice to Indigenous people is extremely important. We cannot rely on the status quo, and if the land is going to be there for future generations or the present generation to be able to enjoy, then there needs to be, I think, drastic action taken, whether it's a mental change, because it is about relationships. It is a relationship, whether or not we want to change this relationship, it's up to us. It's not going to be up to government to decide whether or not we're going to implement this declaration. They have no choice. They've endorsed it. They said they're going to do it. Well, we should take the first steps in saying, we're protecting our land. You cannot have this anymore. You have proven that you have not respected the land. You have proven you don't know how to take care of the land, and you have proven that you do not care about a vision for the future. So it's up to us to do that. So when we say all our relations, we're not just including human beings, as Art has said. You know, we're including everybody. And that's the kind of vision that we have, should have in any climate policy, even within ourselves, and to make it equitable for everybody and allow everybody an opportunity to have a voice. So I guess that's all I'll say for now. Naoko.
Oh, is that Erica?
Okay, good.
Yeah,
You said everything that we needed to say anyway. So.
Yeah. And I'm going to see if I can get Bill back on, and I'm going to go off here and talk to him for 1 second. But let's do questions.
All right, so I think a lot of you talked about the theme of working with governments, but working beyond governments as a necessity. So I'm wondering, in your own personal experience, how much priority, honestly, do you put on things like petitioning the government or trying to reason with, like, the Canadian government or any colonial state versus investing in our own communities or tactics that bring us to the front lines of actions in your own personal experience? And anybody can jump in.
Well, I really don't have a lot of confidence with working with government. I think government has its own priorities. I think that my primary concern is trying to work with our own people about what are your rights, not only just Indigenous rights, but rights as well, and other things, and trying to get up their level of confidence and their level of capacity to be able to interact not only with government but with their own chief and council and with government through that mechanism. I think one of the things that really undermines our organizations right now is government funding. I think government funding, the original funding was for core funding that wouldn't have like a grant, but nowadays the way the government gives its money to the AFN and to the Indian bands like the Nisquamish Indian Band is for delivery of services. It means they actually have to deliver support for the program that they're getting funded from, like whether it be healthcare or education or whatever have you. And literally the first line of defense of the government is actually in our band offices. And it's not, when my dad was fighting way back in the 1960s and the 50s and 60s, there was a difference between government and the Indian organization. And the Indian organization used to be across the street arguing with the government across the street. Nowadays, because we've accepted the education policy, because of the fishery policy or the housing policy, literally that comes into our community, and including on economic development and all those other areas. So the thing is that the main thing is that what we need to do is clean up our own backyard in the sense of making our own political decisions, and then once again forcing government to reflect some of the values that we're trying to teach. But right now, I think government works through the AFN and through the different provincial organizations, tribal councils, and band councils, and I don't want to be part of that. You know, if I wanted to be part of it, I'd run for elected chief and then deal with it. But I'm not an elected chief. So my job is to be an advocate against that kind of. So.
Well, it's been my experience that the government is really good at coercion. They have this down pat, you know, and they like to divide us. And I agree with Art. I think the key is getting our people together and having, you know, there was a time when our people could agree to disagree, They still spoke to each other even if they didn't agree. But you know, I don't have as much confidence in government as maybe some people, particularly because, you know, after what we went through 26 years ago, we still have land being stolen. We're still discussing the same issue. The only thing that the 1990 resistance or crisis resolved was the fact that they weren't going to dig up our ancestors, our family members in the cemetery. But they're still going ahead. They still play games between who is legitimate and who is not. They still don't recognize traditional governments and our voices in that. So, you know, everybody is saying that let's give this particular government a chance because they've made such many promises that look so hopeful, that look so great. But I've experienced within the last 2 weeks cancellations of meetings that I would like to have had with different government agencies the day before. And they're always, I can't remember the word, but they're always giving more place to the band councils. If the band council doesn't know about it or they're not at this meeting, then we can't have this meeting all of a sudden, you know, the day before. So they're practicing the same stuff, the same divide and conquer that they have been all these years that they've been in existence, you know, almost 150 years. When they decide to change and respect Indigenous women's rights, when they decide to expect Indigenous customary rights and then customary laws, then I will say yes. Let's have some hope in how the government is doing. But for now, they're not even ready on how they're going to implement the UN Declaration. You know, they make a promise, but they're not ready to do it. So to me, it's kind of like a stalling tactic. And it's kind of like, okay, let's wait and see. But the key is, as both of, you know, Art and I have both mentioned, and the wonderful work that, you know, Erica, you and Ariel are doing, is we're reaching the people. We're trying to educate the people on what their rights are. You can't sit on your hands with your rights for your rights. You need to go there and be active, proactive, and that's exactly what things like this are doing. So I have more hope in this kind of forum and process than the status quo that we're still you know, we're still mired in.
So I think we have Bill Erasmus on the line, if I am correct.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Bill. We can hear you,
Oh,
Bill.
good. By golly. Okay, attention everybody, mute your phones. All right. Okay, thank you. I've been listening for the last hour or so. And, it's nice to be able to get on the line. Should I make a couple comments?
We would like it if you would just be able to talk about some of the work that the AFN is currently doing to engage on the issues around climate policy and what's currently happening.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bill Erasmus. I am the Dene National Chief, which means I'm the chief of the 30-odd communities that the Dene have. I have a huge land mass. It's something like 360,000 square miles land. And by virtue of having that position, I am also the AFN regional chief, which is the chief of the Assembly of First. Okay, I don't know how well you guys can hear me, but I'm hearing a lot of stuff in the background. But it's like our two-way radio. I'll keep on talking. I'm not going to speak very long. The Assembly of First Nations has a committee that is advising myself, who has the national file for dealing with climate change. We have a committee. We've met twice. We will continue meeting, and we will work with everyone out there who wants to work on climate change, and we will ensure that there is a future for our young people. Very simply, that's what we're doing. One thing I wanted to say, in addition to what other people are saying, is that I think we really have to be cognizant and aware of terminology. We have to be very careful of the language that is being used. For example, there are fires there, and they're called wildfires. No such thing. No such thing as wildfires. What those fires are is they're burning in the forest. They're land fires. And I don't know which people on the line, I don't know if you speak your own language, but look at that. What that means is that it's wild to some people because they don't know the land. They don't know that territory. They have no connection to that area. So for them, it's wild. We are. We're wild to those people because they don't know us. They can't control us. So I think look at our language. If I say fire in my language, a con. Ko means place. Ko means dwelling. Ko means a home or my house. It means where we're from. And then yes, it can also mean a fire, which gives us warmth. There's nothing wild about that. So I think all of this needs to be brought in the right perspective. So I say that, I don't know how well you can hear me because I'm getting a lot of feedback or whatever it's called. So I'm going to leave it at that. I caught some of Art Manuel's comments. I want to thank him and Ellen Gabriel. Art, I finished reading your book. You gave me a copy of your book. I finished it in March, and I really enjoyed it, and I would like to chat with you about it. Thank you. Masicho.
All right, Ganana Escamachan, thank you so much to Dene Chief Bill Erasmus for your comments. All right, so I wanted to again thank Art for his book.
Unmute Ellen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Awesome. All right, so our next question comes from Fatine, who is asking, can you reflect on the limitations of the current climate consultations taking place across Canada? We sort of talked about this a little bit at the beginning. How have they failed to engage Indigenous communities and leadership adequately, and what are they doing to engage Indigenous people and communities? So we can talk about the United Nations, or we can talk about climate plans at a provincial or national level, whatever you have experience with. How do you think it's being done, and what would you like to see changed? Anybody can jump in.
I'd like to see anything in terms of climate change be spoken of from basically the bottom up. I think our land users, like people like Janice Billy and people from my community that are out picking huckleberries or subulali or whatever they're doing in terms of using the land, hunting, fishing, all those things, is that they're the indicators of climate change, and they actually do have stories to tell about how things are happening. And I think the mechanisms that we're talking about is how do you include those people in the dialogue. Now the government is looking at engaging the Assembly First Nations at a national level so that they can have a one-shop kind of unit where they can get all that information. And I just know that the mechanisms of getting that information from the actual traditional land use community level to the chief there's a lot of area in there that there's a lot of missing parts in terms of that dialogue, you know, and I think we're going to lose a lot of connection that way. What can we do to try and change that? That's something that we're going to have to talk about in terms of how do you include these people, because marginalization, when we talk about it, really means that people have been left out of the decision-making process, and in terms of land, stuff like that. So our people don't really have the venues and the places to talk about these kinds of resources, about traditional land use stuff. You have a meeting at a general band meeting, and you're going to be talking about housing, education, a bunch of government type programs, but nothing really talking substantially about the land that much. It just becomes one of the topics of the discussion if it's talked about at all. But anyways, I think that's something that we don't have here yet. You know, it's something that it has to be a goal, I think.
No, I agree with Art. I think I answered most of that question in my previous answer, but you know, we have to take into account that not every single community has high-speed internet. Some still have dial-up. They don't have. If the government is relying solely on the internet to make the consultations, then it's flawed. If the government is relying solely on people who go to attend the AGA next weekend and relying on them to come back, then it's flawed. But there's another aspect of this whole thing about relying on AFN, and it's not meant to disrespect them. There was a time when the matrimonial real property was being discussed. They had given money to each national Aboriginal organization to do engagement sessions. And I remember there was a part, I think it was at the Assembly of First Nations, who said they should not be used as a third party to do consultations on behalf of the Crown. And that still, I think that still applies today. If the government is really sincere on actual free, prior, and informed consent and true consultations, not engagement sessions, then they need to come to our communities. They need to come and talk to us. And they need to be able to tell that to their provinces and territorial governments and municipalities that we have rights and that we have been consulted. Otherwise, I think this is flawed, and it could open it up to another whole thing. And I think we are all interested in how we are all going to deal in climate change. So unless we have a voice, and unless there is something that respects and promotes our rights in this process, then you know we're going to hit out a lot of walls in the future. So they're already starting out with a process which respects a hierarchy, and as Art said, it needs to start at the ground level and go up, not the status quo of constantly going up, and maybe it'll get filtered down.
Great, thank you very much. I don't think Bill is able to answer at the moment, so we'll just move on to the next question, which is, okay, how do we build solidarity in our movements? And so obviously when we're talking about the type of police brutality faced by other groups, Black people in the United States and in Canada, when we're talking about Indigenous groups all over the world, when we're talking about solidarity that looks like being gender inclusive, being inclusive of sexualities, being inclusive of marginalized communities and migrants, how do we build solidarity, and what is our role in making a movement that is specific enough to support Indigenous rights, but also thinking of things in a more holistic manner, as you both talked about?
You want me to go first, Art, since you're always... You know, the solidarity has been something that I've experienced on a personal level and benefited from. We've had people reach out to us in regards to, say, this, if we look at the situation in my community. So we've relied a lot on NGOs, we've relied on civil society organizations They come, they help. They're the constituents of these politicians who make the policies and legislation. So that's how important solidarity is. But at the same time, it also, you know, they're a link to a world, or the world outside our communities. They're you know, I said this before, we should have been assimilating, you know, the Europeans when they came in. Maybe we wouldn't have this problem. Bringing them in and helping them understand. So the pillars, or the whole foundation of the philosophy of our great law of peace, you know, is strength, respect, and love. It's love and compassion and those kinds of things. It's really difficult to do when you're a colonized, oppressed people who are continually trying to survive. It's really difficult, and then sometimes it's not possible. But you know, and I experience it myself. You're human beings. You're gonna make fault. You're gonna make mistakes. Not everybody's gonna be able to talk to each other. That's the reality. But if we understand what the main goal is that we want, perhaps we'll agree to disagree, and then we can move forward on the issues that we keep talking about, and maybe we can have some sort of progress. Because right now I still find that it's stalled. But solidarity is about, again, as I said before, it's about relationships. It's about developing those relationships. It's about keeping them, and it's about keeping those lines of communication open and not listening to gossip, and really having respect for the other person's opinion.
Yeah, I think you know, solidarity is essential if we're going to win this struggle for recognition of Indigenous and our human rights as Indigenous people, because right now we beat them legally, like from the BC perspective, in the courts. Many of the cases that are talked about, the Delgamuuk and the Chilcotin, and those cases are all based on cases that emanated from BC. I think we beat them in the Constitution, where we pushed people like Trudeau back from this white paper policy of '69 to the point where they had to recognize that there is some existing Aboriginal treaty rights. We beat them at the international level every time we go scrapping with them. When Canada voted no to the declaration, then they had to turn around and vote yes, and then they had to uniform, you know, agree to it 100%. So we pushed them around a lot. The main place that we have not been able to really budge them, though, is at the Parliament Hill, in the political sense, and in the provincial legislatures. And the only reason we haven't been able to do that is because they really sense that among the white people and the colonized people on the white side, that if they start recognizing these rights on the ground, they're going to get some backlash from basically rednecks, and they're going to wind up having trouble. So we need to have strong friends who are non-Indigenous who will stand up and support the work that we're doing. And we have that, you know, to a certain extent in British Columbia, for instance. I know we had a big dinner one time in Chinatown in Vancouver, and they sold out. And it was for supporting the Sun Peaks event and Shutika, two of the activist things, and yet it sold out. And the reason it sold out is because way back when the settlers were coming in, they were building railways, the white people used to beat up on the Chinese, and a lot of times they used to go to the Indian reserves for protection from the white people, you know, and their elders told them, this is what these people used to do, and that's how come some of those people wanted to come into this support the Indigenous thing, because they weren't afraid. You know, they said, these people are asking now for our help. We're willing to give help back, and we have a lot of support from East Indian people in the Vancouver area, stuff like that. It's a real powerful relationship, because some of these people were colonized too, just like we're colonized. Now we can explain to them what this colonial relationship is with Canada. They can actually see really how that system works, and there can be some strong alliances there if we have really good communications with them. Because I know with Bill Chu, one of the Chinese support people from Vancouver, one time was telling me, he said when BC had some colonial celebration, they they were asking the Chinese to put in a grant application to celebrate this colonial event. And the old Chinese were saying, how come we celebrate colonialism? We hate colonialism. They couldn't draw the picture. It's the white people that love colonialism. They're the ones that love the crown. But a lot of these people that have immigrated here immigrate from a system that was really living very tragic results under colonialism back home. But the thing is that, we haven't really tried out that kind of thing. But I think we need to educate Canadians and Indigenous people, especially people of recent immigrant people, and bring them on side. The government's not going to do it. I know we say that the government do it, but they're not going to do it. We have to do it ourselves, like most things.
Hi guys. So I'm going to be a voice for Bill right now, and there was a question that was posed to him about what's happening with that sorry, I can't remember which nation it was. The Akaicho Dene being engaged by Canada on the policy. And Bill had some really interesting answers. He gave me a call and sort of let me know that there's a lot of complications, particularly around climate change policy in the north because of jurisdictional sort of jostling for power. Right now, the Northwest Territories as a government, the government of NWT is trying to be the power player and demand that all negotiations for policy goes through the formal, municipal and regional governments of the NWT. And there's sort of been this push-pull between the Indigenous communities, which actually represent a majority of the populations in the NWT, and the formal representative government within the region. And so there hasn't been any direct engagement with any of the Indigenous communities because the government, the NWT formalized government, is sort of blocking that ability for the communities to become more engaged. And that they are trying to find ways to do that. The AFN Committee on Climate Action and the Environment is what it's called, is looking to find ways to disseminate this information around climate change to the people, recognizing that it's been said in the meetings that they aren't a voice for all Indigenous people, and they keep relaying that to the government, that they are not a voice for the Indigenous people, but all that they can possibly do with this committee is to try and disseminate the information as much as possible. And so we have to ensure that all people have access to this type of information around what's happening with the climate policy. And I just wanted to show you on my screen here that, Alan talked about some of the timelines, and that this is exactly what's ridiculous, is the federal government working groups on climate change and their engagement timelines are here. They started in April and they're ending in late fall. The AFN Climate Committee only began last month in June. So we're already behind on the engagement process, even through those formal colonial chains, and we're still trying to find ways to sort of meet these ridiculous timelines. So we're doomed if we do, and we're doomed if we don't, because we're doomed if we do by participating and not being able to access our communities, and we're doomed if we don't, and I don't necessarily believe that that's true, because the timelines are so short, and if we don't participate, then we're not going to get anything at all. And I think that that's the kind of hostage situation that the government tends to put us in, and this is what Ellen and Art have been talking about. It's how do we break these molds that set us up to fail over and over again? And I really, encourage you all to look at these ridiculous timelines. There's 4 tables, and not anywhere in there do I see anything that really represents Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights in a real way. And the timelines in which they're supposed to be engaging and developing policy to address these things are so compact and leaves little rooms for our communities to become engaged. And I hope that answers your question to one of the webinar participants.
All right, thank you, Ariel, for that. So our next question, I think, is going to be in the context of facing this climate violence every single day of our lives as Indigenous people. and trying to be in solidarity and trying to bring in things like gender and sexuality and poverty and racism and dealing with all of this varied violence. What is it that gives you hope to keep going, to keep fighting the battles that you've all fought for such a long time? And what are some concrete examples of actions that you see happening right now on our lands or across the world that make you feel hopeful?
I think it's the teachings that I've been taught that keep us strong, keep me strong. I would hate to think that what we did, 26 years ago was in vain, considering that it hasn't been resolved. But I think too that one of the teachings is that we're supposed to be working for 7 generations from now, because 7 generations ago, the work that they did is allowing us to be able to still speak our language, to still have our ceremonies, to be able to understand what traditional knowledge is, and you have to have hope. Hope is one of the most important things as an individual that you need to have. Hope is part of the promotion and protection of human rights. It's about making positive changes in spite of this quagmire of negativity that we're surrounded by. I think it really has to do with who you are as an individual, the strength you have in your identity, how you identify. Your connection to the land, I think, is a really strong thing in regard to resiliency and hope. Because I think one of the things that we forget is that there have been so many people before us who did all this work for us today, and this is the thing that we are obliged today, living today in this day and age, to be able to do for those babies, and for the future. It's I think it's irresponsible not to have hope, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a lot of hope for our people. I think because there is a lot of energy amongst a lot of the young people to stand up for the land. I just know that from the demonstrations that I see from time to time here in BC, whether it's against imperial metals, or it's against the fish farms, or it's against LNG, or it's against the pipelines. And there's a lot of young people who are out there standing up, like at the Unistuten camp, like out of Lalo Island, all of those places where, big industry, Site C dams, big industries coming in, wanting to make changes. And a lot of our people, our communities are really divided in terms of whether there's no unanimity in opposing them sometimes. And some of these people have to take a lot of flack from our own people in trying to stand up, yet they still have the courage to do that, because they can really, I guess, innately feel that the power to protect Mother Earth, and what that links them up to in terms of their ancestry, whether they be Sagopmuk or Carrier or Simpson or Cowichan or whatever nation they're from. They're in BC. They're really liking that connection, and I think that's the real important thing, and that's where hope, I think, comes from. I think hope is really the only real currency we have as Indigenous people, because we're not on the front lines of money from the NGO voluntary funds and all these different things that a lot of the non-Native Indigenous groups have. We pretty well have to do a lot of our stuff, hand to mouth, from action to action. Like I just got some note from someone regarding the Mount Poly tailings spill. It's going to be for its second year anniversary or tragedy when August 4th, in a couple of weeks from now, and they're talking about taking action around that because they had this terrible tailing spill there, and one of the worst ones in Canada, and the government never did a damn thing. They got a couple of the Indian bands, Soda Creek and Sugarcane, to sign on with the mining company, and nothing's been done. And they just opened the mine again, And the only people standing up to it are the Indigenous people, the young people from that April Thomas and my daughter Canna Hoos, and a bunch of people that are struggling against it, and they're getting support from Indigenous people. So I think the thing is that despite the imbalance, the lopsidedness of this thing, the impoverishment of our side, and the other side having a lot of money, that doesn't mean a lot when it comes to hope, and it comes to courage, it comes to standing up for the land, and that's what gives me hope. And I just think that's going to carry on. I think it's just going to get bigger and bigger. Anyways.
Thank you, Art and Ellen. Our next question is probably going to be our last question, and I'm going to sort of combine a couple of the questions that have been asked. One of the questions that somebody asked is, what do you have to say to leaders in our own communities and leaders in government who are collaborating on projects that, as we've established, end up harming our communities? So, for example, like working to, Ellen, you said, funding an event in the city, a First Nations event in the city, does not count as corporate responsibility when our lands are being destroyed by these same mining companies. So what do you have to say to leaders, either in our own communities or leaders in Canada, in terms of those projects that seem to be about representation and seem to be about equality, but are actually just reinforcing the same type of colonialism?
Well, I think people call that kind of neoliberalism. I think that sort of emanates from the southern part of the North America and South America. But neoliberalism basically means that you sort of think the corporation and making money is going to be the solution to poverty and to the problems that we as Indigenous people face. And there's no question that the lack of money is a problem, that we do need some money. But we need to sort of figure out on what basis are we going to take that money. And the main neoliberal format here in Canada is, okay, we'll just get a timber license, or we'll just participate in a major project by investing in it. We'll just we'll be part of buy into a mining company. And the real problem with that is that if you buy into, let's say, a forestry company, you're going to wind up having to destroy the forest just like the white company did. The clear cutting will have to be the same. Everything is under the provincial law. So you're agreeing to both things. You're agreeing to be you're agreeing to integrate into the white man's economy, the white man's economic system, and you're going to be just as destructive as the white company is. You're just changing, as they say, the color of the hand that's holding the power saw. You're just changing the hand of the color of the miner who's doing the mining. That's all you're doing. You're not changing anything else. It's all going to be the same. And that's not what we're arguing about as Indigenous people. What we're primarily arguing about is that we want them to change their fundamental value system first, where they're not going to engage in destructive behavior just for the purposes of making a little bit of money. They're only going to do things that are really absolutely necessary, that they have to argue with us, and they have to come up with something that we mutually agree is some kind of change in the economic system that we're operating under before we allow a particular enterprise to proceed with. But that's not what's happening under the system right now. Like a lot of the young Indian capitalists that are running around are really just saying, let's just plug into the existing federal provincial capitalist system. And what they're actually doing is benefiting from the activists like my daughter and other people that are fighting to create the fundamental change in development, like people like strong positions like what Ellen Gabriel takes, and that actually help those people to actually get to the table, to actually buy in to an existing pipeline or buy into an existing mining. They're actually a little bit taking advantage of the work that other people are sacrificing to try to create change for. They're actually using those people to benefit themselves. They're the real capitalists kind of buy into that system in that sense too. So the thing is that I don't agree with those people. I think those people, if they want to integrate, they want to join the non-native society, just disenfranchise. Just say we're not native and let's just get in there and be a good capitalist like you should be, and forget about the banking on using indigenous rights to give you a foothold in that capitalist system that's designed to destroy us. You know that. So, anyways, I don't agree with it.
So Bill just texted me to sort of make a little comment to this. And he stated that what we really need right now are protocols, not just with government, but between our nations and between ourselves. And that we need to look at ways to protect our own assets and resources, what our economies are. So he said the Dene economy. And those economies are very different than what we talk about when we think of sort of like colonial economies. These can be things like our ability to sustain ourselves through caribou or bison or moose or any of the, or fish or salmon or any of the species that we rely on. Those are our economy systems, and we have to have protocols to start building these green economies that respect and are based on our own cultural economies, and that we shouldn't be looking and putting so much effort into trying to build protocols between how we relate this to the colonial governments, but how do we relate this between our nations, the Dene Nation and the Cree and the Ojibwa and the Anishinaabe and the Six Nations and so on and so forth. And that's, you know, we can't support these projects that are infringing on these rights like pipelines, and we need to deal with the land that's already under duress, so tailings, oil spills, Mount Poly, and we have to start looking at how we clean up what's already there before we can even start talking about building new economies.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear that helicopter flying over us, but I think one of the things that bothers me about the semantics of this whole discussion, not our discussion, but the discussion that government and corporations have, is about mitigation, when they are required by law to do no harm. And so it's like you're in a schizophrenic and situation, and as you know, Frantz Fanon has called colonialism a mental illness, which is exactly what it is. We're dealing with a mental illness. So mitigation is just another fancy word to give license to corporations to pollute the environment, not to take action when they are destroying the waters that everybody relies on, you know, like the moose, the deer, the fish, our people. And there's been countless of examples across Canada of Indigenous communities experiencing contamination, health issues, especially those around the pipelines. And you know, it's mitigation. They're talking about it here. What's going to happen if a pipeline bursts here? And it's not like if, it's when the pipeline bursts. So they know those things are going to happen. So they're criminally, in a sense, to me, they're criminally responsible for not taking action against these destructive industries. And to say that they're going to call upon corporations to be part of a climate policy, I think is like giving the criminals the keys to the jail. So what we're doing is, if we really insist on talking to the leaders, you have to have a human rights-based approach. You have to have an environmental approach. You have to have a vision for the future so that all our children, all our children's children will be able to enjoy what we have today. I mean, a lot of children today will not be able to enjoy the kinds of things that I did when I was a child, and you know, swimming in the beach or being able to fish or eat the fish in the waters. They're not going to be able to do that today because it's like that today. But the semantics of the thing, we need to start examining. We need to start using our own languages and tell them what the translation is. And we need to be able to start using our ways and our traditional knowledge, our customs that are uplift the people and bring in those those generations that will be able to enjoy, to be able to have the ideas, that concepts of what it means to protect our resources, to protect the people, to promote peace, to bring strength and courage, to have health in our communities. There's all those things which go back to our languages, which go into how we take care of the land. How we take care of the land is how we will take care of ourselves and future generations. So I think it's all about language, and it's all about intent and building those relationships. So, thanks.
Thank you. I think, Ariel, did you have something to say before we end off here?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one more thing. You know, we need to be holding the systems that have sort of put us into this position accountable. And they have laid out a platform for us to do that. Within the Paris Accord, and for those that don't know what the Paris Accord is it's an international agreement to address climate change that was negotiated this past December in Paris at what is called the COP21, or the Conference of the Peoples, under the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what happened at that meeting was there was the recognition, and this is the first document since the development of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has included recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we have to hold governments to task on this. It's absolutely imperative that we do. Right, so I highlighted it right there. Promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the rights to health, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Without this in mind, we have to keep this in mind, not just with holding governments accountable, but with our own people and with our own leaders, as Art and Ellen had stated earlier. What's really interesting about us as a country in Canada, and what we have here is even more interesting, is that Trudeau, the Prime Minister of our country, was the one that championed this language at the COP21 meeting in Paris. He was the one that said that it absolutely had to be included in the Paris Accord. And yet he's come back to Canada and launched this Canada's Way Forward on Climate Change process with no direct engagement or respect of the rights of Indigenous peoples. We need to ensure that we hold them accountable. Caleb had asked, what do we do? Do we have, do we have ways of blocking them, delaying the process? I think that we do whatever we can to delay the process. And if that is by submitting things that this process is broken, by launching interventions, by being loud, and by creating our own processes in our own communities that run tandem to this, that highlight and that are us actually sort of putting the rights of Indigenous peoples into action, which is we can create our own laws and governance of our lands and territories because we have that right, our inherent rights, our treaty rights, and our rights as affirmed under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to assert how we want to govern our lands and territory. That has been respected in the Paris Accord, and we can't forget that when moving forward and addressing these issues. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. If you're looking for where this document came from, it's within the Indigenous Climate Action website. It's the reading package under resources, where it gives you some background information on climate change, including what's currently happening with the government and climate change policy, where climate change at the international level has been negotiated, and just some basic understanding of some of the solutions that are being proposed at the national, global, and global levels. And that's all I really wanted to end with.
Great. Well, we're at the end of our time now. I want to say Ginanas Gomatin, thank you so much to all of our speakers for being part of this discussion. Thank you to the audience. We've had a full chat the entire time, which is extraordinary and shows that we need to have these kind of discussions more. I want to say thank you to our speakers, Ellen Gabriel, Chief Bill Erasmus, Art Manuel. Thank you to Ariel Deranger and the Indigenous Climate Action Network for your organizing. Christine Metler and the Canadian Freshwater Alliance for providing technical support and making the webinar possible. Sophie with Fordham University, Clayton Thomas Muller, Melina Labucan, Sheila Muxlow, and Jacqueline Fayant. And of course, thank you to all of the land defenders protecting our laws and lands. Ginanas Gomatin to all of those tackling forms of racialized and gendered violence. Ginanas Gomitin to the youth, elders, and our ancestors for their continued resistance on these lands and across the world. You can check out indigenousclimateaction.com to stay informed on future events. Ginanas Gomitin, thank you. Until next time.
Nagit wahi.
But